Why was everyone staring? Not the usual glance you get when stepping into a new place. This was different. It was the kind of stare that strips you down, measures you, and quietly decides you don't belong. The bus hissed to a stop at Camp Pendleton, its metal frame groaning under the weight of a dozen new recruits and their heavy duffels. The California sun was merciless that afternoon, pouring molten heat over the asphalt. Maya Chun stepped down last. Her boots hit the pavement with a thud. She tried to make sound confident, but her black eye betrayed her. She hadn't told anyone about the bar fight the night before. She'd been alone at a table, quietly finishing her tea, when some drunk decided her silence was an invitation. Words turned into hands, and she'd put him down too fast for him to understand what happened. But the bruise bloomed anyway, an ugly purple reminder of someone else's mistake. Here, though, it only made her look like trouble. She adjusted the strap of her duffel, the canvas digging into her shoulder. The chatter from the other recruits shifted into whispers at 5 feet 2. With a dancer's frame and delicate features, Maya didn't fit the poster image of a Marine. She looked more like someone headed for a stage than a battlefield. And in the military, first impressions had a way of sticking. Did they lower the standards again? One tall recruit muttered to another. His biceps bulged against the sleeves of his t-shirt, and his voice dripped with lazy disdain. "My little sister's bigger than her," another laughed. And that one got a ripple of snickers from the group. Maya kept her gaze fixed ahead. She'd been underestimated her whole life on playgrounds, in classrooms, even in competition rings. What they didn't know was that her hands had broken boards, disarmed men twice her size, and claimed 3 national kickboxing titles before her 21st birthday. She didn't need them to know. Not yet. The first week was its own kind of war. Morning PT left sweat soaking into her collar, the runs winding through sand and hills. Maya's breathing stayed steady, her body tuned from years of training. But she stayed in the middle of the pack. It was calculated blend-in. Draw no fire, but in the weight carries, the disadvantage was harder to disguise. Her frame buckled under loads that seemed to rest easily on other shoulders. Drill instructor Rodriguez noticed. He always noticed. His voice was gravel over steel when it cut through the yard. "Chun, my grandmother could carry more weight than you, and she's been pushing up daisies for a decade." The platoon laughed, relieved it wasn't their turn under the spotlight. Maya just adjusted her grip and kept moving. The straps bit into her hands, and her muscles trembled. But quitting wasn't an option. Not ever. The humiliation sharpened in hand-to-hand combat training. Rodriguez paired her with Private Thompson, a 240-pound former college linebacker from Texas. The man looked carved out of granite, and his opinions on women in combat were as subtle as a sledgehammer. "All right, Chun," Rodriguez said, voice carrying over the assembled Marines. "Show us how you'd subdue an enemy combatant, Thompson. We'll be your volunteer." It wasn't a drill. It was a setup. Thompson stepped onto the mat, grinning like the outcome had already been written. "Don't worry, sweetheart," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I'll go easy on you." The snickers came again, low and ugly. Rodriguez demonstrated the technica, rear naked choke. Precise, controlled, dependent on leverage, not strength. Maya knew it by muscle memory. She'd applied it hundreds of times. But when she stepped forward, something inside her hesitated. Showing her full skill now would be like throwing all her cards on the table before the game began. "What's wrong, Chun?" Rodriguez barked. "Afraid you'll break a nail? This is the Marine Corps, not a beauty pageant." The laughter broke over her in a wave. Thompson smirked, leaning closer. "Show me what you've got, little girl." Her attempt was deliberately clumsy, and he shrugged it off with insulting ease. Then, for good measure, he planted a massive hand on her chest and shoved her flat onto the mat. The fall drove the air from her lungs, the sound of laughter ringing in her ears as she stared up into a sky so blue it felt mocking. "Get up, Chun!" Rodriguez roared, In combat, the enemy won't wait for you to catch your breath. She rose slowly, her cheeks burning not from the impact, but from the anger she couldn't yet afford to show. Thompson's grin widened, victorious. That night, lying in the dark while the whispers and muffled laughter continued from the bunks around her, she reached for the phone. Her older brother David answered on the second ring. Navy SEAL, protector, the reason she'd enlisted. Through a tight throat, she told him everything. The constant mockery, the calculated humiliation, the feeling she was trapped in a fight she couldn't win. "You have two choices, Maya," he said, voice flat and unyielding. "Quit and prove them right, or fight and prove them wrong. If you fight," he paused, "you fight to win. No holding back, no mercy, no regrets." She hung up and stared at herself in the small mirror above the sink. The bruise on her face had faded to yellow, but her eyes were steady now. Tomorrow, she decided, the pretending would end. 2 weeks passed. On the surface, nothing changed. She was still in the middle of the pack during runs, still taking the criticism in silence, still struggling with the heavy carries. At least, that's what they thought. Underneath, she was cataloging everything. How Johnson led with his right in every punch. How Martinez's guard dropped after a feint. How Thompson's balance shifted when he threw a cross. She was building a mental arsenal. The breaking point came in the mess hall. Johnson, loudmouthed, tattooed, a self-appointed king of the platoon, stood on his chair like a carnival barker. "All right, people. Time for tonight's entertainment. I'm taking bets. How many push-ups before Chun's noodle arms give out?" Numbers were thrown out like coins in a fountain. 8s, 6, 5. Even the other women smirked, eager to stay on the safe side of the social current. Johnson grinned, feeding off the crowd. "You know what? Let's make it interesting. I bet any 10 guys here could take turns with her, and she wouldn't land a single hit." The roar of approval was instant, cruel. Even Marines from other tables turned to watch. Maya set down her chopsticks, stood. The scrape of the chair legs against the floor cut through the noise like a blade. "Johnson," her voice was soft but carried. He smirked. "Yeah? You and 9 of your friends. Tomorrow after chow." Boxing ring. Silence. Then disbelief. She just challenged 10 Marines to consecutive fights. Johnson hesitated, caught between backing down and the weight of 100 eyes. Pride won. "Fine. But don't cry when you end up in the infirmary. I get to pick the other 9. Maya nodded once. "Fair enough. Tomorrow 7. Don't be late." She walked out without another word, the mess hall erupting behind her in bets and speculation. By the time she reached her bunk, a strange calm had settled in. Tomorrow wasn't about proving herself anymore. It was about ending this, and they had no idea what was coming. By the next morning, the challenge wasn't just a rumor, it was wildfire. Word had escaped the mess hall before she'd even left the building. By dawn, it had reached units Maya had never seen. And by mid-afternoon, Marines from across Camp Pendleton were rearranging their schedules. Everyone wanted to see the execution. She spent the day in silence, not a brooding silence, but the kind a sniper wears before pulling a trigger. She went through the drills, kept her posture perfect, and answered orders with crisp, almost musical, "Yes, sir," and "No, sir." If anyone noticed the stillness in her eyes, they didn't comment. Rodriguez did. "Chun," he said quietly as they were dismissed after afternoon training. "You sure about this?" His voice lacked the bite it usually carried. She met his gaze. "Yes, sir." He studied her for a moment longer, as if trying to read the layers beneath. "I'll be at the ring, officially to keep order." He paused, jaw tightening. "Unofficially. I just want to see what you think you're about to prove." Maya only gave him a small nod. The hours crawled. She avoided the mess hall that evening, opting instead for the quiet hum of the women's barracks. She wrapped her hands methodically, not in the stiff, clumsy way of a recruit, but with the economy of someone who'd done it thousands of times. Each pull of the tape was deliberate. Each tuck and fold was a promise. Outside, the buzz grew louder. By 6, the air carried the sound of shuffling boots, bursts of laughter, and the kind of restless energy that precedes a fight. She stepped out at exactly 6:55, the air cooling now that the sun had dropped behind. The low hills, the smell of dust and sweat hung in the air. She walked alone toward the outdoor boxing ring, her boots crunching on the gravel, the sound swallowed by the growing crowd. When she reached the edge of the ring, she saw them, Johnson and his chosen 9. They looked like they'd been cast for intimidation. Broad shoulders, thick arms, some bouncing on their toes, like they couldn't wait to get this over with. Thompson was there, jaw set, eyes narrowed. Martinez was stretching his shoulders, glancing at her with a smirk he didn't quite believe. The ring itself had been transformed. Floodlights cast sharp, white pools across the canvas. The ropes gleamed. Under the light, and the smell of the leather gloves hung thick around it. Marines pressed in shoulder to shoulder, some perched on crates or fences to get a better view. The atmosphere was electric, but not cheerful. There was a kind of quiet edge, like they weren't sure if they were about to witness a spectacle or something else entirely. Rodriguez stood at the center. His presence alone kept the noise from boiling over. Standard boxing. "Rules," he called out, his voice cutting through the air. 3-minute rounds. 1-minute rest between opponents. Fight ends on knockout, submission, or if I decide someone can't continue safely. He looked at Maya. "You still sure?" Her answer was immediate. "Absolutely." Johnson stepped forward first, his grin wide but tight at the edges. He was bigger, heavier, with reach on his side. The crowd knew it, and for a moment the energy tilted toward him as they touched gloves. He leaned down and whispered, "I'll make it quick, sweetheart." Maya's voice was almost too soft to hear. "Thank you. I'll do the same." The bell rang. Johnson came in lazy, confident, his guard just high enough to make it look like he was trying. But Maya wasn't where he expected her to be. She slipped inside his reach so fast it looked like the air had bent around her. The first punch landed square in his solar plexus. The sound was dull, deep in impact that took his breath before he could even react. His body folded, his lungs searching for air that wouldn't come. She didn't wait. A right hook to the jaw sent him crumpling to the canvas like a building with its supports pulled out. 15 seconds, the crowd didn't cheer right away. They were too busy processing what they'd just seen. Rodriguez crouched, checked Johnson, then straightened. Next, Thompson climbed through the ropes, his expression stripped of arrogance. He kept his distance, testing her movement, trying to find an opening. She let him circle, her weight balanced, her breathing even. When he finally threw the cross, she was already under it. The combination came like lightning left hook to the ribs, right uppercut, then a spinning heel kick that cracked against his temple. His body sagged into the ropes before spilling to the mat. 30 seconds, foams came out now. Marines elbowed each other, muttering, this wasn't the show they'd expected. Something shifted in the air, a collective understanding that whatever they thought they knew about her was wrong. Martinez stepped in next. He was quick, light on his feet. But quickness means nothing if you telegraph every move. He swung. She slipped, and a counterhook ended it in 45 seconds. The fourth Marine didn't last 20. He charged. She sidestepped, caught his momentum, and locked him in a submission hold so tight his hand slapped the mat in panic before Rodriguez could even step in. By the fifth fight, the crowd was all hers. Marines shouted her name. Bets flipped on their heads. The longest odds now belonged to anyone lasting more than a minute. The sixth Marine tried to refuse outright. The pressure of the crowd pushed him in, but it was over in 60 seconds with a spinning back fist that landed so clean the sound echoed off the floodlights. The seventh wanted to grapple, but she moved like water, flowing through his attempts until her arms locked around his neck. He went limp in less than 10 seconds. 8, 9. Both gone before their bodies had time to sweat. The ring looked like a war zone now, gloves scattered, medics crouched over the fallen. Marines shaking their heads in disbelief. Only one remained, Williams, 6'4", 250, built like a brick wall. He stared at the unconscious bodies, then at her, his lips pressed tight. "No, sir," he said to Rodriguez. "I forfeit." The crowd booed. Maya didn't. She lifted a glove. "It's fine. Johnson started this. Let him finish it." Johnson, pale and still unsteady from the first knockout, blinked as every eye turned on him. Pride is a dangerous thing. Even limping, even swaying. He climbed back in. The final bell rang. He threw everything into a wild assault. She let him come, her feet barely touching the mat, her eyes locked on his. When he overcommitted, she stepped aside and let her right uppercut rise like a hammer. It caught him clean. His feet left the ground before the mat took him again. Silence, then clapping, one Marine, then another. Until the sound became a roar, Rodriguez stepped forward, lifted her arm high. "Ladies and gentlemen, your new champion of Camp Pendleton." The floodlights burned above her. Around her lay 10 Marines, each one silent. She stood in the middle, her breathing steady, her eyes calm. They didn't know what to call her yet, but they would. By the time the ring cleared, it wasn't the 10 unconscious Marines people were talking about. It was her. Someone had streamed the whole thing, not shaky, grainy footage, clean, well-framed, and with enough crowd reaction to make the video electric. Before she'd even left the ring, phones were lighting up with notifications. It wasn't just circulating through the barracks. It was jumping units, moving through private group chats, spilling into veteran forums. But in the ring, none of that existed yet. There was only the crowd's roar, the sound of Rodriguez's voice announcing her, and the strange quiet that settled into her chest. She'd done it. No. She'd revealed it. She climbed through the ropes without a glance at the fallen Marines. Not because she was callous, but because looking down at them might feel like gloating. And this wasn't about gloating. The crowd parted as she walked. Her boots crunched on gravel again, but this time the sound wasn't swallowed. It was amplified in the hush around her. Marines she'd never spoken to stepped aside, their eyes fixed on her with something new. Not pity, not doubt, respect. Back at the barracks, the adrenaline finally began to fade. She peeled the gloves from her hands, the sweat-damp tape underneath sticking to her skin. Her knuckles were pink, but not swollen. She'd barely been touched. The mirror over the sink caught her reflection again, but it didn't feel like the same woman who'd looked into it 2 weeks ago, that Maya had been hiding, calculating, enduring. This one had nothing left to hide. Sleep didn't come easily. The noise from outside, boots on pavement, bursts of laughter, the faint thump of music from somewhere farther down the base kept breaking the stillness. But it wasn't the sound that kept her awake. It was the awareness that tomorrow everything would be different. And she was right. By breakfast, the mess hall had transformed into something unrecognizable. When she stepped through the doorway, the usual din dropped by half. Johnson was at a table near the entrance, his left eye swollen and purple, his posture stiff. The others, Thompson, Martinez, even Williams were there too, scattered around him. They all stood when she approached. "Chung." Johnson's voice cracked on her name. "Maya." He didn't try to smile this time, not the cocky smirk he'd worn for weeks. "I owe you an apology. We all do." She let the silence stretch just long enough for him to feel it. Then she nodded once, accepted. Thompson shifted in his seat. "I've never seen anything like it. Where did you learn to fight like that?" She set her tray down, meeting his gaze. 3-time national kickboxing champion. Started training when I was 8. Her tone was calm, almost conversational. "My parents thought it would help with discipline, confidence." The words landed with weight, not because of the titles, but because of what she said next. "I didn't mention it before, because I wanted to earn respect as a Marine first. Not as a fighter. She let her eyes sweep the table. Guess that didn't work out the way I planned. They shifted uncomfortably. Martinez rubbed the back of his neck. Why didn't you fight back earlier? When Rodriguez was riding you? He trailed off, the rest of the sentence unnecessary. Maya took a slow sip of coffee before answering. Because that wasn't the right time. A Marine needs to know when to fight and when to endure. Last night was the right time. She paused, her gaze sharpening. And watching all of you when you thought you had power over someone weaker. That was valuable. The realization settled over them like a cold wind. She hadn't been their victim. She'd been their observer. Before anyone could speak again, Rodriguez appeared beside the table. His scowl was still there, but softer at the edges, like it didn't know how to hold itself anymore. Chun, he said, report to the base commander's office at 0800. He hesitated, then added, and for what it's worth. I was wrong about you. Dead wrong. You've got the heart of a warrior. Proud to have you in my platoon. The words landed heavier than the applause from the night before. The commander's office smelled faintly of coffee and dust. Sitting behind the desk was not just the base commander, but Major General Patricia Patterson, the highest-ranking female Marine in the Corps. She was in her 50s, her hair pulled tight, her ribbons lined in precise rows. Her eyes were assessing, but not cold. I watched the video, Patterson said without preamble, 3 times. Maya stood at attention. Ma'am, what you did last night was remarkable. Not just the fighting, though that was extraordinary, but the restraint you showed before it. The way you turned a moment of humiliation into a demonstration of Marine Corps values. Maya kept her eyes forward. Thank you, ma'am. Patterson leaned back slightly. I'm recommending you for immediate advancement to the Marine Corps Martial Arts Program instructor track. For a moment, Maya thought she'd misheard. MCMAP instructors were legends combat tested, years of service, the kind of Marines recruits told stories about in the barracks. She hadn't even finished basic training. Ma'am, you finished basic training last night, Patterson said, her tone leaving no room for doubt. What you demonstrated wasn't just skill. It was leadership, tactical thinking, composure under pressure. That's what we need in our instructors. The accelerated training was brutal physically, mentally, but it wasn't the kind of brutality she'd felt in those early weeks. This wasn't meant to break her. It was meant to sharpen her. She trained alongside Marines who'd seen combat tours, who carried scars they didn't talk about. They tested her at every turn, and she gave nothing less than everything. In time, the skepticism faded. The veterans began to watch her with the same quiet respect she'd seen in the mess hall after the fight. 6 months later, at 23, Maya became the youngest female MCM-AP instructor in Marine Corps history. Her first assignment? Camp Pendleton. The irony was not lost on anyone. She stood at the front of the training mat on her first day. Her students lined up before her, some wide-eyed recruits, some seasoned Marines. Johnson was there too, now wearing the Beldovan. Assistant instructor. Her approach was different from most. No yelling for intimidation's sake. No empty posturing. She taught with precision, with patience, with an emphasis on the mind as much as the body. Your opponent's strength can be your advantage, she told them, if you're smart enough to use it against them. And then she showed them, throwing Marines twice her size with movements so fluid they barely registered until they were on the mat. The 10 Marines from that night became her most loyal partners in training. Johnson, especially, was a different man. He told anyone who'd listen, "She saved my career." I was on a bad path, using my size to intimidate people. Maya showed me what real strength looks like. 5 years later, she opened the Silent Storm Academy in San Diego. Its motto, painted in both English and Chinese across the main wall. Read, "Strength is not about overpowering others. It's about mastering yourself." The grand opening was packed. Marines from across the years filled the room, Rodriguez in his dress blues. The 10 men from that legendary night wearing shirts. That read, I got knocked out by the silent storm. And I'm proud of it. Maya stood before them, her voice steady, her eyes bright. 5 years ago, I was called weak, inadequate, a liability. Those words hurt, but they also taught me something important. Other people's opinions of you only have the power you give them. I chose to let those words motivate me instead of define me. Our gaze found Rodriguez. The Marines who challenged me thought they were humiliating me. Instead, they gave me the opportunity to show who I really was. For that, I'll always be grateful. The applause rose like thunder, but when it faded, she gave them the real lesson. Never let anyone else set your limits, especially when you know they're wrong. The Silent Storm Academy didn't start with banners and news coverage. It started with an empty warehouse, concrete floors, echoing walls, the kind of space that smelled faintly of oil and dust, the ghosts of whatever had been stored there before. Lingering in the air, Maya stood in the center, hands on her hips, imagining what it would become. She saw the mats where sparring drills would take place, the racks of gloves and training weapons, the corner where her office would be a desk, a bookshelf lined with manuals and a few old trophies, not to brag, but to remind herself where she'd come from. The first weeks were quiet. A handful of students, some young Marines, a few civilians curious about self-defense. She taught every class herself, often staying after hours to walk someone through a move until it clicked. It wasn't about producing champions yet. It was about building trust. Word spread slowly but steadily. Her name was already a whisper in certain circles: military, martial arts, women's self-defense networks, and when people met her, they found she was exactly the same as the stories. Calm, precise, unshakable. The Marines came first. Veterans brought their teenage kids, then women from the community who'd been told their size made them vulnerable. Some came in carrying the same weight Maya had once carried, being underestimated, dismissed, even ridiculed. She recognized the look in their eyes. One evening, a girl of about 16 lingered after class. She was small, wiry, and moved like someone who didn't want to take up space. Her name was Lila. She told Maya she'd been bullied for years at school, online, sometimes even at home. She'd signed up for the academy because she was tired of feeling afraid. Maya didn't tell her, I understand. She showed her. She paired Lila with training partners who challenged her but never broke her spirit. She taught her that speed could outmatch strength, that patience could outlast aggression. She watched her grow, not just in skill, but in the way she carried herself. By the end of that first year, Lila no longer walked into the room looking like she wanted to disappear. She walked in like she belonged there. For every Lila, there were 10 more. Men who'd been told they were too old to learn. Women who thought self-defense meant becoming someone they weren't. Kids who came in fidgeting, left calmer. Maya knew she was building something that mattered, but it came with a weight she hadn't expected. The nickname Silent Storm followed her everywhere now. It was in magazine articles, military blogs, whispered by recruits at Camp Pendleton when she returned as a guest instructor. It was on t-shirts and gym bags at first. She thought of it as a joke, just a headline from a viral video. But over time, it became something else. A standard. A reminder that people expected her to be unshakable. That meant no visible cracks, no bad days. And she had both. Some nights after the academy emptied, she'd sit alone in her office with the lights low, scrolling through the day's messages. The inbox was filled with praise, requests for training, stories from people who said she'd inspired them. But occasionally, there were others' messages from Marines who'd been injured, from women who'd been attacked, from men who felt they'd failed to protect their families. They looked to her for answers she didn't always have. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was the knowledge that inspiration was only the first step, and she couldn't walk the rest of the road for them. When it got heavy, She went back to the mats. She'd work through old drills until her muscles burned. Let the rhythm of movement clear her head. Sometimes she'd spar with Johnson, who'd become one of her closest friends. He'd never stopped teasing her lightly, respectfully, but he'd also never stopped looking out for her. "You know," he said, once after she caught him in a clean sweep, "you might be the only person I'd let knock me down twice in one lifetime." She smirked. "Let?" They both laughed. Her public profile kept growing. She was invited to speak at military conferences, women's leadership summits, martial arts expos. She hated speeches, but she learned to tell her story in a way that wasn't about the 10 Marines in the ring. It was about what came before. The endurance, the patience, the calculated silence. At one event, a young officer asked her point blank, "Do you regret not showing your strength earlier in training? Wouldn't that have made things easier?" She paused before answering. "Sometimes easier isn't better," she said. "Sometimes you learn more by watching than by winning." The officer didn't understand right away. Most people didn't until they had their own moment of choosing when to fight. 5 years after the academy opened, she got a letter from Major General Patterson. It wasn't an order, it was an invitation. The Corps wanted her back for a limited term to develop a new close combat training program for mixed units. She accepted. Returning to Camp Pendleton was like walking into a memory with sharper edges. Rodriguez had retired, but his replacement treated her with the respect of someone who'd grown up hearing the story. The new recruits, most too young to remember. The original fight watched her like she was a legend from a history book who'd stepped off the page. She didn't lecture them about toughness. She showed them what it looked like to move without wasted motion, to wait for the right moment. Instead of rushing for the first one, she taught them to read their opponents the way she'd once read Johnson, Martinez, Thompson, and quietly, she reminded herself of the same thing back in San Diego. The academy thrived. She started a scholarship program for underprivileged youth, funded partly by her own savings, partly by donations from veterans who believed in her mission. She traveled overseas to work with NGOs, teaching women in conflict zones basic self-defense. Not every story had a perfect ending. She lost a few students along the way. Some moved, some quit, some fell back into old patterns. Those were the nights she stayed at the academy after closing, walking the mats in silence, but she never forgot what her brother had told her in that late-night call years ago. No holding back, no mercy, no regrets. Regret had no place here. Her legend wasn't built in that ring. It had started the day she stepped off the bus with a black eye and decided to stay. The ring had just made it visible. The older she got, the more she understood that the real fight was never with the 10 Marines, or the drill instructors, or even the doubters. The fight was with the temptation to shrink into someone else's idea of what you should be. And that was a fight she never stopped winning. The night the academy lights went out early, no one noticed except Maya. It was a Wednesday. Classes had ended, the last students filtering out with flushed cheeks and sweat-darkened shirts. Johnson had already locked up the equipment closet and waved her goodnight, but instead of heading home, she stayed going through a quiet solo drill, her shadow flickering on the wall in the low light. Halfway through a combination, her phone buzzed on the desk. The screen lit with a name she hadn't seen in months. David. She let it ring once before answering. "Hey, big brother," the voice on the other end was calm but not steady. "Maya, I need a favor." Those words from David had never been small. He was stationed overseas now, working in an advisory role that officially wasn't combat, but anyone who'd worn the uniform knew better. He didn't explain much, just that he had a friend, a woman named Elena, who'd be coming stateside on emergency leave. "She's been through something," he said, "and she's not in a good place. I think she could use you." "Use me?" Maya asked quietly. "Not for fighting. For whatever it is you do, that makes people stand up again." 2 days later, Elena walked into the academy. She was tall, lean, with the posture of someone who used to carry herself like a blade, but now hunched ever so slightly, as if the world had gotten heavier. She didn't smile. She barely looked around. Maya recognized the signs instantly. Combat fatigue mixed with the kind of loss you can't name in public. They started slow. No drills, no mats, just standing in the empty studio after hours. Talking, or rather Maya talking and Elena giving short, clipped answers. Weeks passed. The conversations got longer, but not deeper. Elena showed up, trained a little, left without saying goodbye. One evening, after the other students had gone, Maya asked, "What was it?" Elena froze. "You don't have to tell me details," Maya continued. "But if you want me to help, I need to know the shape of it." Elena's jaw worked. Then the words came out like stones falling. "It wasn't my first firefight, but it was the first time I froze. Just for a second, it was enough. Someone else paid for it." Maya let the silence sit. "You ever feel like one bad moment erased every good thing you've done?" Elena asked finally. The question landed like a knife. Maya thought of the mess hall, of Thompson's shove, of lying on the mat staring at the cloudless sky. She hadn't frozen that day, but she'd felt the same weight, the idea that maybe the whispers and the laughter weren't wrong. "Yes," she said simply, "but that's the lie." They didn't talk about it again that night. Instead, they trained, at first. It was all muscle memory, basic holds, footwork drills, combinations so simple they could have been done in sleep. But over time, Maya slipped in challenges. A feint here, a sweep there, a change in timing that forced Elena to adjust. She was rebuilding not just the body, but the reflex to keep moving under pressure. Months went by. One night, Elena stayed after class. She didn't ask permission. Just stepped onto the mat, gloves in hand. "You ever fight your own student?" she asked. "Only when they're ready," Maya said. They touched gloves. The first exchange was cautious. Elena circling, Maya reading her. Then the pace quickened. Combinations landed. Blocks tightened. The rhythm of strike and counterstrike, pulling them into focus. Halfway through the second round, Maya saw it. That fraction of hesitation in Elena's movement when she thought she was cornered. It was barely a blink, but it was enough. Maya pressed, not cruelly, but decisively, forcing Elena to either move or fall. This time, she moved. The hesitation was there, but smaller. By the end of the round, they were both breathing hard, sweat streaking their temples. Elena's grin, small but real, was the first Maya had seen. "Guess I didn't freeze," she said. "No," Maya agreed. "You didn't." That night, after Elena left, Maya sat alone in the darkened academy, replaying the fight in her mind. Not because of the techniques, but because of the look in Elena's eyes at the end. It was the same look Maya had worn the day after the ring. The realization hit her with quiet force. All those years, she thought her own fight was about proving herself, but maybe it had always been about becoming someone who could help others win theirs. That idea carried her through the next months, but it didn't erase the weight of her own expectations. Publicly, she was still the silent storm, unshakable, unflinching, but privately, there were cracks. Nights she didn't sleep. Days she wondered if the role she built for herself had become a cage. The nickname followed her into every room, every introduction. People didn't just want to meet Maya Chun. They wanted to meet the legend who'd knocked out 10 Marines. It was flattering. It was also exhausting. At a military leadership conference, a young Marine asked her, "Ma'am, do you ever get tired of telling that story?" She thought about lying, about saying no, because the story inspired people. But the truth was different. "Yes," she said quietly, "because it's not about the fight, it's about what came before it. And sometimes people don't want to hear that part." The Marine frowned. "The part where you waited?" "The part where I was silent," Maya said. "Where I listened, where I learned. That's the part that made the fight possible. Silence. The kind that means someone's thinking about what you just said. When she flew home from that conference, the first thing she did was walk into the academy during a kid's beginner class. She stepped onto the mat, sat cross-legged, and just watched. The laughter. The tiny victories when a move landed. The way a shy 8-year-old lit up when she finally broke a grip correctly. It wasn't the ring. It wasn't the roar of a crowd. But it was the reason she'd stayed in the fight all those years ago. That night, she called David. "Your friend," she said. "Elena, how's she doing?" "Back on deployment," he said. "She sends her thanks." Maya smiled into the quiet. "Tell her she earned it herself." When she hung up, she thought about how many people she'd trained since that night at Camp Pendleton. Hundreds, maybe. Thousands, each one carrying something unseen. Each one fighting a battle she'd never fully know. And she realized maybe being the silent storm wasn't about never showing weakness. Maybe it was about knowing exactly when to speak and when to let the silence do the work. The challenge didn't come in a barracks mess hall this time. It came on a live stream. Maya had been finishing a beginner's self-defense class when her phone buzzed with a message from Johnson. It was short, almost too short to make sense. "Turn on the feed now." She opened the link and was greeted with shaky vertical footage of a crowded MMA gym. A ring sat in the center, its ropes sagging slightly, the canvas stained with years of sweat. The camera swung to focus on a broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut and the restless energy of someone who liked having an audience. "This is for the so-called silent storm," he said, pacing in front of the camera. "You all know the story. 10 Marines, one night, blah, blah, blah. I think it's about time we see if she can still do it." The crowd behind him hooted and laughed. He leaned closer to the lens. "Name's Travis Kane. Marine vet. 2 tours, and I'm calling you out, Maya. You and 9 fighters I pick. One after another. Same deal. Unless," his grin spread, thin and taunting, "you're just a story now." The comments section on the stream was already exploding, half of them calling him reckless, the other half egging him on. Clips were spreading across social media faster than the original fight had years ago. By the time the stream ended, her phone was buzzing nonstop. She sat in her office long after the mats were empty, the echo of her students' laughter replaced by the thrum of her own pulse. She could almost hear David's voice again from that night so many years ago. "Quit and prove them right, or fight and prove them wrong." But this time, it wasn't that simple. Back then, the fight had been about survival, about ending the constant mockery, taking control of her own story. Now, she had nothing to prove. The academy was thriving. Her students respected her. The Marines who'd once doubted her now called her a friend. Fighting Kane wouldn't gain her anything she didn't already have, but not fighting him. She thought about Elena, about Lila, about every student who'd walked in carrying the weight of someone else's opinion. If she walked away, what would they see? A woman confident enough to ignore provocation, or a woman who'd lost her edge? That night, she called Johnson. "You saw it?" she asked. "Everyone saw it," he said grimly. "Look, Kane's a showboater, good fighter, but not in your league. You could wipe the floor with him, but that's not the point, is it?" "No," she admitted. "You're asking yourself if you should." Silence stretched. "Here's what I think," Johnson said finally. "You don't need to prove anything to him, but if you take this, you're not doing it for you. You're doing it for everyone who's been in that position. Everyone who's been told they're not enough. That's the only reason worth stepping back into a ring like that." She didn't answer, but she didn't hang up either. 2 days later, she walked into Kane's gym. It smelled of chalk and sweat. The walls plastered with fight posters. The crowd had gathered early, phones already out. Kane stood in the ring, bouncing on his heels, grinning like he'd already won just by getting her there. Well, the legend herself," he said into the mic. "I was starting to think you ghost me." She climbed into the ring without a word, her movement unhurried, deliberate. The gloves were already waiting. Kane leaned closer. You ready to show the world you've still got it? She met his eyes. I'm ready to show him something. Not sure it's what you think. The format was the same. 10 opponents. Kane first, his chosen fighters after. The bell rang. Kane came in hard. Heavy with confidence, she didn't meet him head on not yet. She let him throw. Let him feel like he was pressing her. The crowd roared with each near miss. Then, without warning, she shifted, slipped inside his guard, and landed a clean body shot that made him falter. Followed it with a hook to the chin. He stumbled, eyes wide-knot from the pain, but from the realization that she was holding back. Full speed, he growled. She smiled faintly. Not yet. The fight went another 30 seconds before she dropped him with a perfectly timed counter. The crowd erupted. The second fighter. Kanan swinging wild. 35 seconds. The third was fast, but predictable. 42 seconds. By the fifth, the crowd had changed. The laughter was gone. The noise was sharper, now half awe, half disbelief. By the eighth, people were standing on benches, recording every second. When the ninth went down, Kane stepped back into the ring, still winded from the first round, but too proud to let someone else finish. You could have ended me in 10 seconds, he said quietly as they touched gloves. Could have, she agreed. The bell rang. She didn't draw it out this time. 2-move slip. Hook and Kane was on the mat again. The gym was silent for half a heartbeat before the applause crashed down like a wave. She raised her gloves, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. Then, she spoke not into the mic, but loud enough to carry. This isn't about me. It's about not letting anyone else decide your limits. Remember that. The applause still rang in her ears hours after she'd left the gym. But applause is a strange thing. It fills the air for a moment, then leaves a silence that feels even heavier. The streets outside were slick with rain, the glow from streetlights smearing across the pavement. She walked alone, gloves slung over her shoulder, her breath still slow from the controlled pace she'd kept in the ring. It wasn't exhaustion she felt. It was clarity. When she reached her apartment, she set the gloves on the counter and poured a glass of water. The mirror above the sink caught her reflection damp hair. A faint red mark on her cheek where one of Kane's jabs had landed, eyes steady. As ever, she leaned on the counter and let the question surface. Why did you really do it? It would have been easy to say it was for her students, for Lila, for Elena, for the shy 8-year-old who'd be back in class tomorrow morning. And that was part of it. But under that, there was something else, something that reached all the way back to a mess hall years ago, to a room full of laughter that wasn't hers. That night at Camp Pendleton, the fight had been about ending the whispers. Tonight's fight hadn't been about whispers. It had been about shadows, about proving to herself that she could still step into the light and find the same calm she'd found back then. The difference was, she no longer needed the wind to feel whole. She just needed to remind herself that she could choose it. The next morning, she walked into the academy before sunrise. The mats were empty, the air cool and still. She liked this time before the noise of the day began. Before anyone else arrived, she rolled her shoulders, stretched, and went through a slow warm-up, not for training, but for the rhythm of it. Breath, movement, silence. Halfway through, Johnson appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. You looked good last night, he said, handing her one. She smirked. I should hope so. You're the one who made me spar with you every Friday for a decade. He leaned against the wall. You know you didn't have to take that fight. Nobody would have thought less of you. Maybe not, she said, but someone watching would have thought less of themselves if I didn't. He tilted his head, considering. You've really turned into Patterson. She laughed, the sound low and unexpected. If I start giving speeches about proper ribbon placement, stop me. They drank their coffee in silence for a moment. Then Johnson said, You ever wonder if people will still talk about you in 20 years? She looked down at the mats. Not really. I just hope they remember the right things. Later that day, she held a class for a group of new students, mostly young women, a few men, all of them carrying that mixture of eagerness and doubt she could spot from a mile away. She didn't mention Kane, didn't bring up the fight. She started the way she always did, with balance drills, teaching them how to find their center. Your stance, she told them, isn't just physical, it's mental. You can't hold your ground if you're already halfway out the door in your head. A young man in the back raised his hand. What about when someone's bigger, faster, stronger? She smiled faintly. That's the easy part. You use it against them. They move through combinations. The sound of gloves hitting pads filling the air. She walked among them, adjusting foot placement here, correcting a guard there. At the end of class, she gathered them in a circle. Some of you came here because you want to win fights, she said. That's fine, but I'll tell you what I've learned. You won't remember most of the fights. You win. You'll remember the ones you walked away from. You'll remember the times you chose patience over pride. And you'll remember the moment you realized you didn't need to prove yourself to anyone. She let that sit. But when you need to prove yourself, when it matters, don't hold back. Not for them, not for you. Do it because someone else is watching, and they need to know it's possible. That evening, after the academy emptied, she found herself alone again. She unlocked a small cabinet in her office and pulled out a box she rarely opened. Inside were mementos from her time in the Marines. The faded gloves from Camp Pendleton, her first instructor's belt, a photo of her and David in uniform and tucked into the corner. A folded piece of paper, Rodriguez's final training report on her. She unfolded it, eyes tracing the handwriting. It was blunt, in the way all his reports had been. Chun possesses exceptional technical skill, patience, and tactical judgment. Exhibited strategic restraint in high-pressure situations. Underestimated at first glance, lethal at second, she smiled at that last line. It was the closest thing to poetry she'd ever heard from him. Gently, she folded the paper and set it back in the box. Then she closed the lid and locked it again. Not to hide it, but to keep it safe. Because some things you don't need to look at every day. You just need to know they're there. The Kane fight faded from headlines faster than the original had. But among the people who mattered, her students, her fellow Marines, the veterans who came to watch, it left an echo. It wasn't about 10 knockouts this time. It was about showing up, about choosing the fight. Not because she had to, but because someone else needed her to. And that, she realized, was the difference between the recruit who'd stepped into the ring at Camp Pendleton and the woman she was now. Back then, she'd fought to claim her place. Now, she fought to hold the door open for others. It was a warm evening when Maya returned to Camp Pendleton for the last time. The sun had dipped low, washing the parade grounds in gold. Recruits moved in tight formations across the yard, their boots thudding in rhythm, the sharp cadence of a drill instructor's voice slicing through the air. She stood off to the side, hands clasped loosely behind her back, watching them. Some moved with crisp confidence, others eyes darting, steps a fraction behind, were still finding their place. She knew that feeling. Major General Patterson had invited her to speak at the graduation ceremony. Not about the fight, Patterson had said over the phone. About everything else. It wasn't the first time she'd been asked to speak here, but she suspected it would be the last. When the ceremony began, she sat through the speeches, the awards, the slow roll call of names, and then Patterson stepped to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," the general said, "you're about to hear from someone who changed the way this base talks about strength." Applause rose, polite at first, then swelling. Maya walked to the microphone, her steps measured. Her eyes scanning the crowd, she saw the same mix she'd seen years ago, faces full of anticipation, faces half-guarded in doubt, faces that hadn't yet decided what they thought of her. She let the silence sit for a heartbeat before speaking. "When I arrived here for the first time," she began, "I was underestimated before I even set down my duffel bag. I was told, without words, and sometimes with them, that I didn't belong." A ripple moved through the crowd. "I could tell you about the night I fought 10 Marines. Most of you already know that story. What you don't know," she said, her voice steady, "is that the most important part of that story happened before the first punch was thrown." She told them about the silence, the weeks of being tested, mocked, pushed to her limits not by combat, but by doubt, about how she had watched, learned, and waited until the moment mattered. "Patience," she said, "isn't weakness, it's strategy, and knowing when to fight is just as important as knowing how." Her gaze moved across the crowd, finding the younger recruits, the ones whose eyes flickered with something she recognized. "You will be underestimated, sometimes because of how you look, sometimes because of what you believe, sometimes because someone else needs to feel bigger. That will never stop, but you get to choose how you answer it. You can fight every battle and wear yourself down to nothing. Or you can wait, prepare, and choose the fight that matters." The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of the ocean from somewhere beyond the base. "When that fight comes," she said softly, "you don't hold back. You don't fight to prove them wrong. You fight to prove yourself right. And you fight so someone else, watching from the back, knows they can too." She let her hands rest lightly on the podium. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. For a moment, there was no sound. Then the applause started, measured at first, then rolling over her in waves. After the ceremony, a group of recruits gathered near her. Most were shy, asking for photos or signatures. One young woman hung back until the others drifted away. "Ma'am," she said, "I've heard about that night since before I enlisted. I thought it was just a fight story, but it's not, is it?" Maya smiled faintly. "No, it's a patience story." The recruit nodded slowly, as if filing the answer away for a time she'd needed. Later, alone in the quiet of the empty parade ground, Maya walked toward the same spot where the bus had dropped her off all those years ago. She could almost see her younger self stepping down, the bruise on her face, the whispers starting before her boots even hit the pavement. She didn't feel the sting of that moment anymore. What she felt instead was gratitude, because without it, she might never have learned the discipline to wait for a moment. The base lights glowed in the distance. Somewhere, a drill instructor's voice barked in the dark. She breathed in the cool air, letting it settle. The legend of the silent storm would outlast her. That much she knew. It would be told in barracks, in gyms, in classrooms. Sometimes exaggerated, sometimes stripped down to its bones. But the real legacy wouldn't be in the story itself. It would be in the choices people made after hearing it. In the young Marine who chose not to break when the laughter came. In the student who stepped onto the mat for the first time, unsure, and left standing taller. In the woman in a crowded mess hall somewhere, setting down her chopsticks, standing up, and saying, "Tomorrow, 7 o'clock, don't be late." The drive back to San Diego was quiet. The city lights came into view, the hum of the tires against the road a steady rhythm. When she reached the academy, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of mats and chalk. She turned on the lights, stood at the edge of the main training floor, and looked out over the space. Tomorrow the students would be back laughing, sweating, learning. Some would stay for years, others would drift away, but each would take something with them, even if they didn't realize it yet. She picked up a pair of gloves from the rack, turning them over in her hands. Then she set them down and walked toward the office. On the wall above her desk, framed in black, was the Academy's motto. Strength is not about overpowering others. It's about mastering yourself. She stood there for a long moment, then switched off the lights. The room fell into darkness. the words on the wall just barely visible in the glow from the street outside. And in that quiet, Maya smiled, not the smile of victory, but of someone who had chosen her battles, fought them well, and left the door open for others to do the same.